The old story from a new part of the world. Sweden is mechanizing her small but efficient army, and we bring you the first pictures of her tank corps as they move out into the fields round Stockholm on maneuvers.
What you just saw is an old British news report announcing that Sweden was modernizing its armed forces. The reason why they had to arm themselves to the teeth was simple. They were convinced that they would be invaded by the Nazis. Faced with uncertainty, the best thing they could do was prepare their soldiers and have their tanks ready for action. However, the power of the German army was immense, and in an open battle, it would destroy its enemies. How then did the northern country avoid being conquered? Today, in this new episode, we will tell you everything about Sweden's role in World War II. Let's start by reviewing Sweden's background. Although in the 20th century it stood out for its strict neutrality, its history is full of cruel and violent wars. In the Middle Ages, it was known as the land of the infamous Vikings, the warriors who ravaged Europe for generations, plundering and destroying everything in their path. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, it was involved in wars against Russia, Denmark, Norway, and Poland. Virtually all the nations around it suffered some attack or attempted invasion. Later in the 19th century, Swedish rulers abandoned the path of arms and decided that diplomacy was the surest way to grow and prosper. Until 1939, the year in which humanity embarked on the most tragic and terrible war in its history, it remained at peace. Already in the First World War, Sweden remained neutral, and at the end of the war it dedicated itself to solving its internal problems. There was a strong socialist movement fighting to reach the government, which took its inspiration from the Bolsheviks, who had made the October Revolution and founded the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, the communist leader, was more than willing to help the Swedish socialists take power. However, what happened was that, at the beginning of the 1930s, the state was left in the hands of a group of social democratic politicians. The new authorities were extremely cautious and opposed the country meddling in the continent's conflicts. At that time, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini were in their prime and ruled their empires with an iron fist. Everything pointed to the fact that there was a war about to break out in Europe, and that the main contenders would be Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, the Soviet Union, and Western capitalist powers such as Great Britain and France. The Swedish Social Democrats wanted to stay out of this catastrophe, as they were convinced that Sweden had nothing to gain. Not only would hundreds of thousands of people die, but the country would also lose its autonomy by allying itself with any of the other nations. They also had reason to fear Joseph Stalin, who had his own plans to expand into the Northern Territory. The Swedes were playing a risky game. They wanted to remain neutral in the middle of a world that was headed for a massacre. The slightest mistake could cost them their independence, so they had to think twice before taking a step. To begin with, they dedicated enormous sums of money to improving their armed forces. It was a way of preparing for the worst, although deep down they knew that they would not be able to resist the powerful armies of Germany or England. They bought tanks, rifles, pistols, and artillery, and in 1938 they decreed that all men over the age of 15 had to undergo brief military training. If the nation were to be invaded, then they had to have as many soldiers as possible. In this sense, there was nothing worse than an inexperienced and poorly trained combatant, since, at the first shot, he would try to leave the battlefield in panic. Sweden was confident that the Germans and the Soviets would keep themselves busy fighting each other. However, this proved to be a false hope, because in 1939, they signed the infamous Ribbentrop-Molotov Non-Aggression Pact. Thanks to him, Hitler and Stalin agreed not to attack each other for the rest of the war. This put the Swedish government in trouble. The political situation in Europe was a wildfire. All that was missing was the spark that would blow everything up, and when the conflict broke out, Sweden took it for granted that it would be one of the first nations to be invaded. The only unknown was whether the attack would come from Germany or the Soviet Union. This doubt was resolved almost immediately when, in 1939, Stalin launched a brutal offensive against Finland, unleashing a conflict that would go down in history under the name of the Winter War. Since Sweden and Finland were neighboring countries, they had great social and cultural similarities. For this reason, the Swedish population was in favor of breaking neutrality and helping their neighbors in the fight against the communists. In fact, some 87,000 men volunteered to join the ranks of the Finnish army. Here you can listen to a fragment of the speech of a general of the country to the volunteers.
Jag hälsar eder, svenskar, med vilka vi på många slagfält under sekler delat segrars ära, men också nederlagets bitterhet. Värdiga det svenska namnet, att tusenden av eder ställt sig vid vår sida.
Due to pressure from the people, the Swedish government abandoned its classic policy of impartiality and declared itself a non-belligerent country. In practice, this meant that he would not participate directly in the war, but would help Finland with money and weapons to expel Stalin's troops from their lands. He even helped evacuate some 70,000 children who had lost their homes or been orphaned during the conflict. Now, as in any war, nothing is certain, and from one moment to the next, everything can change completely. Beginning in 1940, Swedes felt the threat of Nazism more than ever. Hitler's forces conquered Denmark in a matter of hours, and in the following months, they did the same to Norway. Sweden had stationed its troops on the border with Finland to protect itself from a possible Soviet attack. However, now things had changed, and the offensive was most likely coming from the Germans. Germany issued a threat to the Swedish government. If it mobilized its soldiers, even preemptively, this would be seen as hostility, and they would have no choice but to invade. The authorities reacted quickly and organized the sending of letters to each of the homes in the country. In them, the men were warned that they should arm themselves and report to the nearest military barracks. This is how, in a matter of days, Sweden amassed a force of more than 300,000 soldiers ready to fight. Although in the end it was not necessary for them to march into battle, this was a sign of the patriotism of its citizens and their willingness to give their lives for their land if necessary. Meanwhile, the Nazis were advancing across Norway, subduing the population and destroying those who opposed them. Although the nation had been almost completely conquered, there were still pockets of resistance that refused to die. For this reason, the German High Command demanded that Sweden give them access to its telephony and telegraph networks. This would give them more information about their enemies' movements and make it easier for them to win. The Swedes accepted the proposal, but at the same time, they tapped the lines to be aware of German communications. By spying on their messages, they were able to decipher the codes they used to encrypt them. Sweden passed the Nazis' confidential information to its allies in the Polish resistance, who, in turn, passed it on to Britain. This gave the English an advantageous position during some of their engagements against the Wehrmacht. However, this did not mean that the British trusted the Swedes. Quite the opposite. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, established a blockade on the country that nearly choked off its trade. For their part, the Germans also sent ships to patrol the coasts of Sweden. Our protagonists were in a catastrophic position, surrounded by enemies and with an economy on the brink of disaster. This unfavorable situation led them to collaborate, on some occasions, with the Third Reich. One of them was in 1941 when Hitler was preparing Operation Barbarossa, that is, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This time, authorities allowed German soldiers to use their trains and railways to transport themselves to the communist nation, as this was more reliable than traveling across the treacherous sea. So that you can imagine the danger that this implied, keep in mind that, even today, German shipwrecks continue to be found on the coasts of Norway.
Underwater engineers found an ugly piece of history earlier this summer. It was the wreck of a Nazi warship off the coast of Norway. The remains of the German boat were first detected by sonar 3 years ago. But when crews from a Norwegian power company were able to examine the wreck more closely, they were startled to find that it was emblazoned with a swastika.
A large part of the Swedish population was scandalized by the fact that their leaders collaborated with the Nazis, although they could do nothing to prevent it. In reality, for the government, it was a matter of mere survival. It believed that openly confronting Hitler would end in tragedy, and that it was preferable to help him from time to time so as not to incite his fury. Furthermore, a large percentage of Sweden's exports were destined for Germany, so if they wanted to keep their economy afloat, they had to protect that relationship at any cost. Although this was the darkest side, it is also true that during World War II, our protagonists helped save countless lives. To begin with, some 50,000 Norwegians fled the clutches of the Nazis and headed to Swedish territory, where they found a population willing to receive them and give them shelter. Similarly, in 1942, the government allowed Jewish refugees to stay there so as not to be killed by the Holocaust. This allowed half of Norway's Semites, about 900 people, to escape the clutches of death. Furthermore, almost all of Denmark's Jews settled in Sweden and survived the Nazis. Now, the Germans were aware of the maneuvers that our protagonists were making, despite having declared themselves neutral. So, why didn't they invade them? Without a doubt, the Führer had reasons for wanting to take over the country. This land was rich in iron mines, one of the most coveted resources in the world, especially in times of war, where having a supply of raw materials was essential. The Third Reich's original plans were to take over Northern Europe, invading first Denmark, then Norway, and finally Sweden. However, the latter never materialized. It is possible that they did not see it as necessary, since the Swedish authorities were willing to collaborate through diplomatic channels. At the same time, it is also true that Germany was too busy battling the Allies, who, after 1941, were joined by the United States and the Soviet Union. In reality, the reason why the Third Reich never invaded Sweden is as simple as it is curious. When the German High Command announced that they would attack the Swedes, the commander of the German Air Force, Hermann Göring, opposed it. Outraged by what he was hearing, he left the meeting and requested a personal interview with Hitler. He was not just any man, but he was the Führer's right-hand man, as well as one of the most prominent members of the National Socialist Party. He was considered the best airline pilot in the Nazi Empire, and there was not a soldier who did not respect his reputation or fear his steely personality. Here you can see him practicing one of his favorite sports, animal hunting. Göring had a personal reason for Sweden to be free from harm. After World War I, he had married a Swede named Karin von Kantzow. He was so in love with her that, in her honor, he went so far as to name her Berlin mansion Karinhall in her honor. In addition to the romantic side, the marriage helped him become friends with great politicians, businessmen, and prominent figures in Sweden. To all of them, Göring had promised that, if a war broke out, the neutrality of his country would be respected, and they would maintain their independence as long as iron exports to Germany were not interrupted. It is for this reason that the Air Force commander was enraged when he learned that the Third Reich would break his oath. Scandalized, he met with Hitler and explained the situation to him. He argued that his honor depended on the Swedes not being invaded, and that, if this happened anyway, then he would have no choice but to tender his resignation. The people who dared to threaten the Nazi leader could be counted on the fingers of one hand, and Göring was one of them. The dictator was so fond of him that he finally gave in to his demand, ordering the military high command to cancel plans to conquer Sweden. Ultimately, this was what ensured that our protagonists maintained their autonomy and that their population was not annihilated by Nazism. In 1945, at the end of the war, the Swedes were harshly criticized by the Allies, particularly by Winston Churchill. The British Prime Minister considered that they had failed in their moral obligations by collaborating with the Germans. The Swedish government, on the other hand, never showed remorse for its actions. From his point of view, it was about doing what he could to survive. Today, the role of the Swedes in the war remains a matter of controversy. It is probably a question that will never be settled and will remain open to debate. We come to the end of the video and we want to ask you, do you think Sweden should have openly confronted the Nazis? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.